Do you have a favorite?
Not meant to. But mostly the unloved ones, the unvisited ones, the cases that get dusty and ignored. All the broken and shunned creatures. Someone's got to care for them. Who shall it be if not us?
Yes.
Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the very best new and old ideas for living in this world. Coming to you from 43 degrees south on a small farm in deepest Tasmania. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, we welcome to the show Bint Al-Shalabiya. Bint is an artist, performer, magician, traveller, and teacher. She joins us today to talk about Islamic folk magic, Hermeticism, the importance of travel and ceremony, and the supreme importance of right relation. Bint, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me. Really glad to be here.
No, totally. Well, first-time guest, traditional first-time guest, first question. Were you a weird kid?
Quite the question. Both yes and no. I mean, I was definitely a weird kid, but I also had kind of a strange, weird, unconventional upbringing as well. So a lot of the weirdness as a kid seems to be by circumstance. And I feel like I definitely got weirder as I got older. But yeah, I was born to parents in Los Angeles. My dad is from Pakistan and my mom is Egyptian. And I was raised within the Muslim community, very, very sheltered upbringing. I went to private Muslim school from age 2 all the way until 8th grade. And my mom also worked at the mosque and at the school based at the mosque. So I was pretty much raised in the mosque. Like most of our weekends, we were with her at school as she was doing stuff. And even all of our summer and winter vacations, for as long as I could remember as a child, was at the mosque. And a lot of people don't understand that when a lot of cultural enclave groups are based outside of their homeland, whatever that might be, or away from their diaspora, especially like in the West, there's extra effort to keep the tradition enclosed. So it can be a lot more intense of a cultural and religious experience than, let's say, if I was raised in Egypt or Pakistan or such. So raised in the mosque pretty much. And it wasn't just any mosque either. This was the Islamic Center of Southern California, which is located on Vermont in Los Angeles. And especially at that time in the 90s and early 2000s, that was the center and spokesplace for all of the Muslim American efforts in the States. So like anything that happened relating to Muslims or the Middle East, during that time, the spokespeople that you'd see on CNN or on any of the news networks were from this Islamic Center, and I went to school with a lot of their children. So we were really at the forefront of a lot of the American Muslim matters. I remember being a kid and we would have regular like bomb scares, having to be evacuated from class and go to like, the SWAT teams and everything, and going to like the local park. And that was like our way out of class, and being at the front lines of a lot of the like protests at embassies, consulates, and such. So it was a very interesting, unconventional American childhood experience for sure. And there was a small stint where we moved to Pakistan when I was 6, and we stayed there for 9 very long months before my mom decided to bring us back, that we couldn't really be raised there long term, me and my younger brother. So when we were out there, somehow my mom found a school in the capital that was it was a satellite school run by Al-Azhar Sheikhs. And Al-Azhar University is one of the most prestigious centers of learning and knowledge and Islamic universities from like the 7th century onwards, based in Cairo. It was strange to find a school for children that I attended for a few months.
And you said like 6 very long months. I mean,
9 months.
with 9, right? So you didn't especially enjoy it, or was it just? I mean, why was it long?
Well, it was definitely a shocking experience, like a very much like a Dorothy not in Kansas kind of experience for a 6-year-old. Just the school run by these sheikhs and like, just some of how they like treated the students was not what I was used to, like reaching outside of the classroom and grabbing a branch off the tree to like hit kids that were not behaving properly. But also just culturally, it was just very, very different. And I had a lot of family drama and really, really massive issues that had come up as well while we were out there. That was part of what led to us coming back. And coming back, and my mom and dad kind of separated after that for some time. But I came right back to the Muslim community, who really took us in at that time, because my mom was basically like a single mother, which was really rare in the community at that time period. Now it's a lot more common. But yeah, back then it was definitely a little bit weird. And that's where I started noticing some differences with my peers, like get treated a little differently when your dad isn't around. And also that I wasn't fully Arab. Like I wasn't Arab enough, and I wasn't Desi or like South Asian enough. And, just issues around like not having as much money as the other kids, and colorism because I have darker skin. So, you start noticing those things as you're a kid, but they affect you when you're like older. You don't really notice it that much. But yeah, so it was just a pretty much typical Muslim experience, though, aside from that Pakistani stint. And yeah, and then after that, my mom, she got a job starting a Muslim school in the San Fernando Valley, which is like 30 minutes outside of LA proper without traffic. And right, with traffic, it can be up to like 2 hours. But yeah, so we moved to the Valley, and that was my first year attending American public school, which was my first year of high school. And my first year, I was forced to wear a hijab, or like the Muslim headscarf. And 9/11 happened that year. So it was like a quadruple whammy. It was really, really an intense experience coming of age. And 9/11 was like, September. So that was like only 2 weeks into this school year, freshman school year. So it really colored my whole coming of age process. And mind you, when I say I was very sheltered, I had no exposure to American music, American pop culture at all. So I had never seen any like American movies of like to prepare me for like the mythology of like American high school and what comes with that. Yeah, it was just a real shell shock. Let's see, I quickly discovered what depression felt like. It was, oh, and on top of that, my mother, well, it wasn't so much a religious factor, but we didn't have that much money. And she was also working so hard to put a roof over our heads that she didn't have the bandwidth to really deal with how I should dress as a woman coming of age. So she forced me to wear a uniform to school, like on top of wearing a headscarf. I was forced to wear a uniform to school that did not wear a uniform.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was all around just a pretty rough experience. A lot of bullying and just comments and remarks, a few hate crime kind of stuff, but that was also just kind of given the environment at the time. After 9/11, all the Muslim community kind of banded together because there was a lot of issues happening all over the place. But yeah, that was a pretty difficult time period, but I always had some way to like exercise my will, even when I had all the odds against me. And one particular, there were a number of experiences, but one was I was pretty much emotionally checked out of high school, barely got passing grades, just like B's and C's, and spent a lot of time just sleeping in the back of the class, not engaging with anything or anyone. And but I would sit in the back and draw like henna designs and doodle, and I somehow really like tagging. a lot. And I remember once there were these two Latina chicks who were in one of the local gangs, and they became friends with me in the back of the class. I forget what class it was, but I would help them with some of their like tests. They could copy off of me, and they like taught me how to tag, and like I like learned their ways. And I would be this like undercover hijabi girl that was completely unassuming, and I would like tag up the entire like girls' locker room and some of the offices and places around the school, and no one would ever know. And I got off on that.
I like it. Brilliant.
Yeah, it was pretty random, but yeah, it was fun. And but in contrast, though, I kind of lived for the mosque because my mom worked there, so I'd go there after school, and I was really popular in the Muslim groups and with the girls. And I was actually a little bit transgressive even around this time. Parents started not allowing me to hang out with their daughters because just things that I was interested in, and like I taught myself how to dance, and I was teaching some of the other girls how to dance, just off of like streaming and like LimeWire videos and reading books and stuff. So that was like the beginning of just being a little bit weird and not acceptable. Like my interests weren't acceptable. Anyway, so I graduated and I went to a local state university. And in my second year, I decided to take off my headscarf, my hijab. And the funniest thing happened where in taking it off, all of a sudden I wasn't being grouped with this Muslim identity, and I had to like publicly identify as Muslim all of a sudden for the first time ever. And I was minoring in religious studies and communication studies at the time, so I'd find myself in some of these classes where the like certain topics would come up, and normally if I was in the class with a hijab on, people would just not bring things up because they don't want to offend me. But now they would say all kinds of shit, and I would feel obliged to kind of like stand up and like voice my opinion, which I'd never had to do before, and it was really exciting. So I found myself getting really involved on campus. I became the first female president of the Muslim Student Association on campus at the time. Ran for student body. It was an interesting time period, but since I had taken off my scarf, people in the mosque and some of the friends and circles I was in, especially in the MSA, they weren't taking me seriously, and starting to affect like how like people's reception of me, and it just got increasingly kind of just petty. A lot of the arguments and issues that people were so concerned with were just so small, in my opinion. And I was kind of aiming for like larger things on campus that wasn't in alignment with a lot of the groups and where they were thinking, where they were at.
So was that, I mean, what was the decision to, what was the thinking behind taking it off in the first place then? Because obviously you would, my follow-up question, but we've already hit it, was going to be, how did that go in like the mosque community, given that you obviously you noticed a change in the college community, which is fascinating, by the way. Yeah, because I worked with a woman, just post 9/11 in New Zealand, and she started wearing one after that as a like sort of shoring up of identity. She sort of grew up not wearing one and then did. She said it's kind of like a time I want to feel. So, but it's interesting because it's actually, I think what she was looking for is sort of what you found in reverse, which is like, I don't need the drama of these conversations. And so she went in that direction. But like, what was the thinking behind taking it off?
Well, taking it off was actually interesting, and this is kind of a theme in how I navigate my life, and definitely plays a part in why I connect so much more with the occult tradition compared to like the mystical tradition, where I tend to navigate life in this sense of almost an experiment, like collecting data, and just social experiments of sorts have always been a thing for me that I naturally go towards. So the decision to take off the hijab was actually after a series of social experiments I did, where for one summer I went to the local community college to do some extra courses. And this was a campus that I didn't know anybody. It was there were no Muslim people from the communities that were there, and small classes, all of that. So I just told myself, you know what? Everyone has always told me, like within the community, of course, that it was all in my head, that no one was really treating me any different when I wore it and when I didn't. So I decided that I would sneak, and when I got dropped off, I would take off my scarf and change my outfit, which I had never done before, and just see what happens. So I did that for this one class, just like one semester in the summer, and it was a world of a difference. Just how everyone relates with you, down to like even the professors, the people sitting next to you. It was so different. And after that, when I went back for whatever, like fall semester or whatnot, after that, I just couldn't bring myself to put myself through that experience and to leave that part of my human experience that I was like keeping myself from. Um, I just couldn't do it. So I made the decision, and yeah, it was a really big deal in my family, obviously. And the like your family name and reputation is a really big factor in the Muslim community, especially in general, but definitely in America. And yeah, it didn't go so well, but at the same time, this was one of the first experiences where I was really exercising my will and just saying like this, I will not put myself through that again. Like I want a full experience in college, you know. And then in the mosque, I mean, of course, it was a big deal, but like people always find something to talk about, so that blew over pretty
Sure.
quickly.
So when you look back on it, do you think that sort of independent exploration or transgression or whatever was kind of like a necessary foreshadowing for finding magic in the occult, because it does kind of take that willingness to center your own experiences and your own kind of desire against that of like, any kind of community to sort of find it? Is it part of that? Is the taking off of the hijab like the first ritual act, if you will?
Perhaps. I mean, that was definitely the first one where I willingly took that on with the idea of there was a different human experience I wanted and needed to have. And that was my way of, you know, yeah, I guess a ritual act would be a way of saying it, but it does get better. Like, I guess this is the beginning, the first act, but yeah, it definitely was. Yeah, I took on a few other things that really pushed different boundaries. And I also do want to add, like, I know plenty of really, really badass women, Muslim women who choose to wear the hijab. It's not against their will, and they are amazing, powerful, empowered females. So this is just my experience, and it was forced on me. So I just do want to add that in.
Oh, totally, totally. Where are you with it now? Are there some days where you're like, I'm in a hijab mood, or is it like not
Oh,
quite like that?
no, no, I love the ritual of it. A few months ago there was a funeral that we for a family, a really, really close family friend, a funeral gathering that we went to, COVID friendly. But I was so excited to be able to wear the traditional clothes, like have an excuse to wear traditional clothes and wear the hijab like in the proper way, wearing the pins how I used to wear it. It's just when you make peace with the trauma and the issues that we have, which is also part of, you know, the mystical and magical work, is to, you know, refine a lot of the issues and fragmentations and that we've had and picked up along our experiences. But yeah, I'm at a really great peaceful place with it.
Yeah, cool. So I want to ask you how you sort of found magic, but when I have guests who've grown up in like a very religious situation, it tends to be a twofold thing, which is the discovery of magic in the sense of it being a corpus of material to do with operating in the more than human world, but it's also a realization that there are things that happen to them or were around them in their childhood growing up, successful prayer and so on, that falls into it. So tell us about how you came to be in magic in the occult, and whether that whether you had experiences like that, or like, oh shit, this is a thing
Mhm.
that I had, successful prayer or so on, growing up. Was it that kind of dual understanding?
Actually, no, I didn't get into anything mystical or magical until a number of years later. So after I took off the hijab, and then I had this kind of falling out slash I wasn't so welcome in a lot of the Muslim circles anymore. And I also started meeting and making good friends with non-Muslims on campus for the first time, and realizing that people my age normally didn't have to deal with such heavy burdens of like family honor and answering for like the whole Muslim diaspora and conversations, just things like that. Like, people go to parties, or they, go to a music festival and enjoy life. So um, then I turned 21, and that was where I really took that kind of science experiment, gathering data methodology into, like, I put it into practice, where there are all these things, like just experiences of being American that I knew I didn't have. I had no concept of, that I needed to fill in the gaps of understanding. So I turned 21, and within the first week, I become a Hollywood club promoter.
Cool.
And yeah, I just needed, I mean, you're supposed to go to clubs, you're supposed to have sex, you're supposed to drink. And I had to understand how those systems work. So I became a Hollywood club promoter, and, you find out what makes the hip hop places cool and what makes the other ones not cool, how the lines work, the doors, the bouncers, just all of that. I learned it really quickly, and also learned that you can't really make much money off of it unless you have unless you have friends who are rich single white dudes who want to get bottle service. So I realized that wasn't really a profitable thing for me. I did really like dancing though. So, but it's apparently an American thing, really, where guys just feel it's okay to come up behind you and like grind on you and stuff if you're on the dance floor, which is really disgusting for me. But I saw these girls who were dancing up top. No one could touch them. They were wearing fabulous, amazing outfits, and they were having so much fun, and they were getting paid. So I wanted to do what they were doing. So I went and auditioned and got a number of residencies all around LA and Hollywood as a go-go dancer. Um, and yeah, I quickly fell into like the underbelly of Hollywood. Had some amazing friends that I met. They became like my best friends. Lived on their couch for a bit when I couldn't go home, and they were all like DJs, go-go dancers, professional poker players. It was a hoot. It was really a whole eye-opening experience. Yeah, and I went pretty deep, like invitations to the Playboy Mansion, Playboy cruises, like exclusive parties, just everything you could imagine. It was just the whole other world that opened up to me, and I was still in school too. Um, but it was towards the end. I graduated pretty short after that. And then when I graduated, the economy was really, really bad. Unemployment rate was also like at a really high point at the time. And I, yeah, I swear I'm like every Muslim parent's worst nightmare. I lied to my mom and said that I had an internship in Barcelona. And I went backpacking by myself for 3 months through Portugal, Spain, and Morocco, like kind of out of nowhere. I mean, I'd always been really fascinated and drawn to southern Spain. That's the only place. I went to Barcelona, but it was mainly Andalusia in the south. And yeah, it was just a trip, and I needed to go. I needed to do that. And later on, when I studied tarot, I remember coming across the Fool and seeing like the Fool. I was like, oh my God, and reading about it and studying, and it was like, oh my God, this is my Fool's journey. It was completely insane. I didn't speak any Spanish, like barely any Spanish, just like whatever I picked up from living in LA. But yeah, it was completely insane. Obscenely low amount of money, and yeah, just a lot of, I don't know, flirting with death and danger and just the magic of the road. But experiences like that, specifically this one, are so life changing in the sense where like your entire reality is shattered and your sense of self is completely obliterated, and you have to surrender to the road and the world around you, and also at that the world comes to life, and you realize how interactive reality really is and how malleable it also is, and it was a really eye-opening experience.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, nothing like the road as a teacher for that, the interactivity or the co-creative capacity of just like being in the universe. I think that's totally true.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, it was eye-opening, very, very, very magical experience. Just learned a lot about myself, but more of just like how this interactivity of this game of life really could be. And let's see, and then
So give us an example of that, because I mean, it's yeah. Give us an example of like it certainly helps to not have very much money or kind of know where you're going to stay that night and just sort of give it over to reality. But are there any examples from your trips that have stuck with you about that realization?
um gosh, there's like so many. Well, one that was really far out, it's like really, really strange. So I'll skip that one. I don't know.
It's funny when you think, no, yeah. This one, this went straight into stories I do not want to talk about.
Yeah. Oh, there are plenty of those, believe me, on this trip. But yeah, I had a lot of. I mean, this isn't so much the interactivity, an example of it, but I had some of my first like past life affirmational.
Ah, see, I was going to ask about that. Yeah,
Yeah.
because what do you think it was? Um, what do you think it was that originally pulled you to that area? Because it is sort of one of the things we're going to be talking about is, of course, the Arabic influences on, quote unquote, Western occultism.
Mhm.
And you traveled around its holy land for a while.
Absolutely.
And and so do you think, were you always fascinated by that corner of the world? Or did you just wake up one day in LA and go, I think I kind of need to go to southern Spain? Like, how was it? Because I was going to say, do you think there's a past life component? But tell us about it.
Oh, no, definitely a past life component. Actually, believe it or not, I didn't know at the time, but I have a great great grandfather who's Southern Spanish, most likely Gypsy, dark skinned medicine man who's adopted um, in the family. So there's that. I didn't know until afterwards about him. But definitely past life experiences, like I had number of experiences where one in particular, I remember um, just turning a corner in one of the old barrio areas and some old man in his doorway singing and playing his guitar, and I was just brought to my knees, like crying, just sobbing, an overwhelming like yearning and longing and sadness, um, just in public. I just had to like kind of move my way into like an alley and just like what is happening, and pretend like I don't know, I don't know, like I was on the phone. I forget how I like passed that off in public, but yeah, there were experiences like that. A lot of experiences in Granada and Sevilla in particular. But like with the gypsies, the local gypsies, like recognizing me as one of them. Like I swear they would just like say stuff. I had one experience where I went into complete trance in one of the underground flamenco bars and just broke into dance, kind of dueling with the freaking real deal old school flamenco dancer. And I had never heard the music before or anything, and it was totally welcome. And it was like celebrated, and they were just like, "Yeah, it's in your blood. It's in your blood." Just like things like that, like really a number of far out experiences like that.
Love it.
Yeah, but yeah, and I've done medicine, plant medicine, like ceremonies and stuff, and I have found myself going back to southern Spain multiple times in those journeys. Definitely a number of past life, especially related to initiatic traditions of some kind, are tied to that region.
And was that a moment? You mentioned actually our mutual friend said, it's on my list. We should talk about our shared Peruvian
Mhm.
experiences in that sense. But was this little southern Spain, northern African journey, like the taste, it's like, oh, I'm into this. I'm gonna now I do travel. Now I do adventures. Is that because you kind of have to have one of those major experiences to then take yourself off to places like the jungle to do those things? Was that it for you? It's like, yeah, I'm gonna be something of a wanderer.
Oh, traveling, absolutely. Like as soon as I left the States and landed in Lisbon, actually, I also had some far out experiences in Sintra, which is a town right outside of Lisbon. Really magical, potent town. But oh yeah, as soon as I left, I learned very quickly that I didn't want to be identified with being American on the road, just the really obnoxious on the road. Um, and yeah, I also knew that I belonged and felt more at home outside of the country, to be honest. And yeah, traveling after this, that was definitely a thing for me.
All right. So was there, I mean, how did you first encounter, magic in the intellectual sense? Because
Well,
you obviously experience it, you live it, right? Like past life experiences and those profound sort of phenomenological moments when you are somewhere like, Andalusia. But when did you kind of tell us the story of getting into it
believe it or not,
professionally?
I still didn't get to anything that mystical yet. So after that, I returned back to LA and I returned back as an artist. I couldn't do a desk job at all. And I fell into the Burning Man community in Los Angeles. They kind of took me in. Just a string of events connected to some of the go-go dancing gigs that I was doing. And it was really wonderful. They like not only took me in, they like celebrated me expressing myself flamboyantly as a performer. I had access to studio spaces and stages. I was started getting booked for things and touring some of the bigger festivals through those circuits. And then fell into Hollywood costume designing even. It was really cool. Took on like a stage name and you know figured out what my art was and felt like, and had places to show my art for the first time ever. I really got to identify as an artist and performer and dancer for the first time. And also, I got to study dance, which before it was all like a lot of self taught. Um, and at this point, I was completely on outs with my family, absolutely no relation to Islam at all. I was adamantly looking and searching for my own spirituality at this time. But after a few years, it got really old in the New Age circles, just being the token brown girl, surrounded with like all these people who are just romanticizing and exoticizing you, and everyone's listening to like vaguely ethnic bass music and wearing bindis and changing their names to like Shakti and Krishna and stuff. And like, I don't know, it got a little old. And at that time, especially, there weren't that many people of color or brown people. So I was kind of hungry for that. And things finally started to get a little bit strange, like definitively strange in 2012 when I went to Mexico with three other friends for there was a solar eclipse that was happening at the time, and we went down there. We went to Chichen Itza for the eclipse, and I had my first set of mystical experiences out there. Uh, let's see how much of it I'm going to share. So we get there, and there surprisingly weren't that many tourists. We were expecting it to be a complete like hubbub, but we get there, and there weren't all that many people. And there was one like female shaman who had a following of people. I don't know if she was from Mexico, but she was speaking Spanish, but a following of all kinds of people. And most of them were wearing white. And they show up in this clearing in front of the Chichen Itza pyramid. And she starts doing an invocation. And this is as the sun is kind of going through its like critical point of the eclipse, where things are getting extra shadowy. And we're on the outside of their circle, obviously, and just holding space, closing my eyes, not really trying to be part of their thing. And I made an effort. At the beginning, it was an effort, but once I started I stopped trying to understand what she was saying in Spanish, and all of a sudden things started to make more sense. Like of what she was saying, I was able to understand her. And at one point, she started invoking the four archangels, and something kind of clicked in me, and I recognized like some of the names related to the archangels in Islam, like Jibril and Mikael, and all of a sudden I got this rush of like electricity, of energy kind of just running through me. I'd never felt anything like that, and I had this overwhelming urge to pray. Like I was just possessed by this. I had to pray, and I remembered all of a sudden that there's a specific prayer that you do during an eclipse, and mind you, I hadn't prayed in years at all. But it was this overwhelming experience. So I went and found my girlfriend and forced her to give me her shawl that was holding all her souvenirs. It's like I need that right now. She gives it to me, and I go around the side of the pyramid, and I mean, this is like, a huge, massive pyramid, and I go around the other side, and surprisingly, there's nobody there, not even a security guard. It was just like me in front of the pyramid and this great plain, and I just start offering this prayer. And the Islamic prayer is very physical, so you're doing movements and all of this, and it just electricity running through me, and all kinds of insights and messages coming through, and tears coming down, and even the verses that were coming to me was like from Surat al-Shams, like the chapter of the sun, and in that chapter it talks about this ancient civilization of the people of Thamud, which were these people who transgressed and were taken down. And I'm like in front of the like pyramid of the sun of the Aztecs who were taken. It was just like so much going on. But a lot of things came through. But one of the main things that came through in that prayer was that I was trying so hard and actively trying to deprogram my Islamic upbringing and conditioning, and I was searching everywhere for my own spirituality and all this stuff, and I was shown how I chose this very particular curated Islamic experience and identity and bloodlines for specific purpose, and to stop fighting it. And I was like going to like yoga retreats and stuff like that, like looking for that tingly sensation of feeling of the divine, where I already have that. Like I was hardwired and have like major software loaded on just saying a few Arabic words and doing a few things, and I get that warm tingly sensation, like I'm already connected, and to just like roll with it and stop fighting it. That was like the main thing that came through. So that was a really wild experience. But the next day I had my first experiences with the dead, which had never been a thing. Like I had like kind of past life weird kind of experiences, but I didn't know what that was in the time when I was in Spain. But this was like straight up like mystical experience of the imaginal realm, where like we were staying on the grounds for at the Chichen Itza pyramids. They have these hacienda plantation houses that they turned into boutique hotels, which I don't know who thought that was a good idea, but it's super haunted. And there's so much pain and suffering on the land, and it's definitely in some of those places. But we were staying in one of those spots, and the next day, it was like I think around sunset time, I was walking around the grounds, taking a walk, and kind of called towards one of the churches on the property that a lot of local Maya still go to. And I was kind of drawn towards this back area, which was definitely like pretty sure slave quarters of some sorts. But I had this experience where I didn't see the dead, but I was aware of them, and they were aware that I was aware of them. And I felt their pain, and I felt their distress, and there was some that were trapped type of a feeling, and the part of me was freaking the fuck out. It was just like, what is happening? But then there was this other deeper, wiser part of myself that was very grounded, that I had never experienced before, who knew exactly what to do and what energy and prayers to send them. And that was that. It was a really interesting experience. So that happened, and then a few days later, we go to Uxmal, which is a town in the north of the Yucatan, still in the Yucatan region, and super magical, a really potent place. More jungle, and definitely more of a Maya characteristic to the energy, more feminine than like the Aztec solar patriarchal type of vibe. And there I had, I won't go into a lot of the experience, but I actually had an experience where I got a transmission from an artifact over there, a divine, like feminine energy, and that kind of came alive through a statue, and that was communicating with me, and had certain experiences that translated in the moment to the physical, where it to make sure that I knew that I wasn't imagining what was happening. And yeah, that was my Mexico experience. It was really earth shattering. Not really earth shattering. It's just like it was just very strange. I returned back to LA after that, like, what the fuck is going on? I knew I wasn't completely insane because I had met crazy people before in the Burning Man scene. Like, no, like for real, people who are trying too hard to activate their Kundalini and it does not have good effect, like legitimately going crazy, and also, drugs and stuff. So I knew I wasn't insane, but I definitely needed answers. I was very confused. And really short after, but I also had this interactive, I don't know, I was already navigating my life in this kind of interactive, fantastical way of sorts. So I knew that I could pose these questions and contemplate on them, that I'd be given answers. So really short after returning, I actually came across, someone gave me a book on, it's called Awakening by Pir Vilayat Khan, who's the son of Inayat Khan. And my first book on Sufism. And believe it or not, up till that point, I actually kind of subscribed to the idea that Sufis were heretical, just from how I was raised, that they weren't really Muslim. They were just some like offshoot kind of thing. But yeah, so I came across this book and I was blown away. He goes through these mantras and like pranayama breathing exercises in the book, that which I had been around in the New Age communities, people gather around and do like kirtans and all of that, but they never did anything for me. But this was actually plugging in Islamic names and divine names and concepts that I was raised on, and it worked. And that really blew my world open in a way. It turned me on to Sufism, at least. And then soon after that, I came across the works of, I was actively looking for everything Sufi online, and I came across the works of Wahid Azal at the time, and he had put out a lot of really, really interesting and concise documents and prayers and invocations on scribes.com, and there's stuff on academia.edu that I was coming across as well. But his stuff was really interesting because, I found one podcast in particular, but he was speaking on Muslim magic from the Ruhaniya perspective, which is like a form of Sufi white magic. And he has an order that he founded and is a part of in that vein. So he's talking about Sufism, Muslim magic, which I had never really heard about, and an ayahuasca as well, and they incorporate that into their ceremonies. And I was like completely fascinated. I had done a ceremony not that long previously, and it was really intense, a lot of ancestral healing. But so I was grabbed by his work. And in the podcast, he was asked any books he would recommend, and he around Western magic, which I'd never really heard about, and he recommended any of the works of Julius Evola, of all people. And
Yeah, wow.
I know, right? But so I go and I get the book Introduction to Magic by Julius Evola, and I soaked it up. And that book in particular, it's a collection of essays by him and a number of initiates in his group. And it's actually really, really well written. And I remember soaking it up. And not only that, it was the strangest thing where I'm going through it, and it was like, you know, when you find one of your old notebooks and you're going through and remembering some of the material, is just like, oh yeah, that, and that's how that works. And it's like reading my old notebooks between like me and my friends, you know, notes from my friends. It was really bizarre, but that's how it felt. And I remember waking up one morning as I was going through and reading this book, and I was just gripped by this need to find a mystery school. Just like, I need to find a mystery school. And out of all of the ones I could have found, I mean, I didn't know at the time that they were located in LA, but I found the builders of the Adytum, and they have a temple in Highland Park in Los Angeles. I found out later, but I really liked the simplicity of their website and just how they worded things. And it was just $18 a month for correspondence courses. So it was like very low barrier to entry, no harm trying it out. So I got those in the mail, and it was just everything changed from that point on. The I really, I mean, he doesn't get enough credit, I feel, in a lot of the Hermetic circles, but the work of Paul Foster Case and Ann Davies, they really left behind some really golden material as far as their correspondence courses go. It's really, really well put together, and just the system of training that it takes a person on their own like path of self-study. It's really, really tapped in. But so one of the main things with that work is the Hebrew, and I was really fascinated by the Hebrew letters. When I was really young, my mom really encouraged me. It was actually one of the only art forms she really encouraged me to do as a child, like pretty young, was Arabic calligraphy. I got a lot of Arabic or just calligraphy sets, like for many Eid, like holiday gifts. So I already had this connection with the power of the letter and with ink on paper. And so seeing the Hebrew letters really did something to me, and actually taught myself to read and write it really quickly in a matter of weeks. I picked it up really fast. And around this time, I was still reading, you know, journals and stuff I would find on academia around like Sufi magic. And I came across this one Sufi saint, Hazrat Nun al-Misri, Egyptian, like a 9th century Sufi saint, and he started showing up a lot for me in a lot of different books and articles, and then he started showing up in other ways, and he was kind of this like way shower between, and he showed me kind of, well, he didn't like show me, but they're like brought to my attention or reminded me that the Arabic alphabet and Hebrew alphabet are very similar. Arabic just has a few additional letters. So with that, the gematria is very similar as well. So I started diving really deep and just not so much the mathematics of the gematria, but the drawing of the forms of the letters of the inks. It was a really big thing that brought me into that world. And then I stayed with that system of Boda, Builders of the Adytum, for a number of years, doing the self-study. I didn't really connect with their church. They're very like Christian, like their temple services on Sundays. Or, I mean, to me that was really cool, like going to some of the services, because to me, like, oh my God, there's a choir and people are singing, and it was just like very exciting for me coming from a Muslim perspective, like romanticized worship, you know. But yeah, it wasn't really my thing, and they tend to put a lot of efforts in kind of removing a lot of how much Paul Foster Case was an actual ceremonial magician, and trying to like legitimize his work as more of like philosophy, which is completely ridiculous. So at some point in my self-study, I felt I needed to join an order. I needed to practice with magicians and just be initiated into a temple. So I found a ceremonial magic group that actually had branched off from Paul Foster Case's work in Boda, that I got initiated into and started working that system. Not exactly Golden Dawn, because Paul Foster Case he was pretty high up in the Alpha at Omega. at one point, but when he started his own order, he put more emphasis on Hebrew as a technology, and removed a lot of the Egyptian claptrap from the Golden Dawn. So the system was a lot more emphasis on Hebrew and that kind of working the Rosicrucian grades.
Very cool. So one of the things as you're telling me the story that is fascinating is that it's almost like it's hermetically nested or fractal. A whole bunch of stuff that it's like it came out of sequence. So there's the Arabic magic stuff, which you kind of didn't at the time know was what it was when you're in Spain. And the Chichen Itza experience is fascinating because it's during an eclipse. So it's astrological magic, and it's the angels themselves who actually bring you back to it. And it's in that encounter with sort of, Islamic prayers that it all kind of fits in, and it's the use of those words which you then sort of manage to overlap with the calligraphy in Hebrew. So it's the most amazing kind of like non-linear uncovering. Does that make sense? Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. No, the fractal nature of it, like very much so. And another thing, real quick, about the experience in Mexico is that from some of the local Maya, that one of the girls in our group, she spoke Spanish, so she was also an adventurer, and she made friends with a lot of the local Maya who invited us to their homes and stuff. And apparently, among the locals, what was more a rare event of that weekend that we were there wasn't so much only the eclipse, but there was a direct alignment with the Pleiades. And there was a bunch of stuff happening with the moon and Venus also at the time. So that was more of a thing for the local Maya, which in another way, back then I had no idea what any of that was. But now looking back, like things like the star systems and stuff tend to come up pretty regularly. So there's I'm not surprised to see how that also played a part in the kickstarting
Yeah,
of all
and
of this.
funnily enough, it's almost like it had to come through in the locations you were in. But if you have an experience of a statue speaking to you, that is an hermetic
Mm.
process. So you actually got all of it happening, but because you were in Mexico, it's it's happening in the context of that particular landscape. But it's a really interesting yeah, like non-linear uncovering. So your first experience, I mean, this is a good question now, years later. So I guess your first experience of Hermeticism was through, as described in Builders of the Adytum and so on. Like, what is it to you? Because, and I ask because there's it's Egyptian and so are you, and it's diaspora Egyptian and so are you, and it's this kind of weird. I'm very interested by. I think Hermeticism is more Egyptian than people realize, like because it's it's a Greco-Egyptian blend, blah blah blah. But I think it's actually more Egyptian than people realize. But like, what do you think it is? How do you describe it to people, and what's your sense of it? Like, what is Hermeticism to you?
Ooh, good question. Even my immediate response differs when you say, "What is it to me?" Because a lot of when I do have to describe it to people, it's through the idea of Hermetic Kabbalah, which is using
Yeah.
Hebrew as a technology. Like, what does that even really mean? But, ooh, hmm.
It's not like it's a simple question. I'm not
Yeah,
going to lie.
not at all, especially because right now where I'm at in my practice and uncoverings is I'm like, yeah, historically, I tend to be really drawn to southern Spain and different time periods there. But also, another thing that really comes alive for me is and it's still a path that I'm uncovering, or that's being uncovered for me as I'm exploring, but of the particular movement of when the Arabs set up shop in Cairo and in Egypt, like the Caliphate. Um, and hmm, yeah, when the Arabs set up shop in Cairo, and a lot of the Kemetic and Pharaonic traditions, as well as the Neoplatonic and Hermetic traditions, had to go undercover under Islamic rule. So a lot of that information got hidden within Sufism, which would be mystical Islam, and then also within the Coptic traditions. And there's a particular vein of Sufism that comes from that time period in those regions that are different from the Sufism that you'll see in Turkey or Iraq, or wherever they land. They tend to travel with a dynamic tradition. Um, the Sufis are a dynamic tradition, but so answering what Hermeticism is to me, I don't know. Could I pass on that and maybe think about it and come back
Yeah.
to it?
Well, it's funny because I'm going to make the case that maybe you actually did just answer it, because I experience it as a bundling up of, I don't necessarily like the word technology in this instance, but a bundling up of doings and understandings so that they can survive in a new context. So it's not exactly like it's a protective coating so much as it's like a transmutation into a new thing. That's why I experience Hermeticism as being more, um, for me, Hermeticism, I would almost define it as um, survival of thinkings and doings from dynastic Egypt into a post-dynastic Egyptian world, which would include things like you were saying, the Sufi and Coptic praxis that have Egyptian origins, is in a way Hermetic to me, right? Because there are axioms that are Hermetic, as above, so below, et cetera, but they're Hermetic axioms because they are concepts that come from
Mm-hmm.
dynastic Egypt. So that's kind of my, like, Hermeticism is dynastic Egypt in diaspora, I guess.
I like that. Hmm.
Nice
I'm
one.
still,
Okay, well, good.
I'm still kind of chewing on that one. But no, that I agree. I concur.
Because I'm very interested in technical Hermetica, more so than the text, because the texts are, I mean, they're beautiful, but they're not my cosmology. They're sort of um, basically Neoplatonic kind of stuff. Isn't necessarily my cosmology, but my cosmology is there in the technical Hermetica, which is that sort of horizontal resonances of things, right? Like it's a bit more animist for me, but it's also messy and incomplete. And I have made the case in various courses that basically the entire European herb lore tradition is in fact technical Hermetica. We just don't know it, but it's that sort of post-dynastic Egyptian survival of the different resonances of herbs and stones and fish and stars and so on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that's why I kind of have this definition of it being dynastic Egyptian thought in diaspora, because I don't think, and I get why academics would be like, well, the corpus hermeticum plus a few texts that we occasionally call technical hermetica are it, but it's not quite right. Like it's more diffuse. It's kind of this living framework that has managed to find a way to survive, and a whole bunch of stuff that we may not immediately think of, like certain Sufi practices or certain herb laws. And I'm really, and obviously image magic, seeing as we're going to talk about, like, Arabic influences on quote unquote Western occultism. Um, there are there are things that have survived from dynastic Egypt that are not immediately obvious until you sort of sit with them. But yeah, that's my thought on what
Mm-hmm.
that's my definition of Hermeticism.
I love it, especially in the context of the diasporic traditions, because it does tend to be widespread and will only become more widespread as we move through time and space.
Totally. So when we're in this journey, and we'll do it this way and land on your definition of folk magic as well, just to give you, because when we talk about things like Islamic folk magic, but on your journey through a kind of very, very Rosicrucian European Christian esotericism, um, at what point do you start to find those Arabic influences on what we would consider, because they're substantial,
Mm-hmm.
what we would consider Western occultism? Was there an intellectual journey going through? I mean, you mentioned caliphates, but like, the Abbasid translation projects and so on. Did you find that historically, or did you find that through the course of, practice?
A little bit of both. I did have to kind of dive more into the Sufi aspect on my own. Obviously, that was not really part of the Rosicrucian grade work curriculum system, because at the same time, at this time actually, I was like really working heavily with this ceremonial magic group, and first time showing up at the temple and working with other magicians in an initiated way. And then I also I was still performing and dancing at the time, but I was incorporating a lot of Sufi work into like my performance, like the whirling in particular, into some of the performance art that I was doing, and stage stuff, incorporating a lot of Arabic and calligraphy again into my visual art, and was doing murals at the time. And I actually found a teacher, Khadija Radin in New York, who taught Sufi whirling. She was from the Mavlevi order, studied extensively in Konya, where Rumi is buried. So I studied with her just a few workshops in New York, and then one year she invited some of her students to on a trip to Israel, Palestine, and Turkey, and we got to visit with different Sufi orders out there, and that was the first time in a long time that I really, really connected on a heart level. It was almost like a homecoming to my culture and ancestry and Islam on like a cellular level during that whole trip. And I also saw, especially in Israel, like these experiences where the tarot cards would come to life almost. Like I'll be in a
Oh,
situation where
cool.
it was like, that is the death card in front of me right now. Like all the symbolisms like in one frame of a movie, shot, and things like that. But it was in this context of Arabic and Hebrew as I was traveling through some of these parts of the land, which was really far out. How I was able to pick up on both. And then I was also raised around a lot of the Arab community I was raised around were from the Levant area. So I was very familiar, I'm pretty fluent in speaking the dialect of Arabic that they speak like in Palestine and Israel. So I got to experience things very profoundly on a very deep level, and both at the same time of like Hebrew and Arabic. Like we're bringing both traditions together, if that makes sense.
So I have to ask, did you have, I mean, you got the very Paul Foster Case idea of encountering the Trumps in life while you were there, but did you have past life stuff? All of that kind of story of the Sufi stuff and Jerusalem and so on is very you in this incarnation, but was there more of that kind of Southern Spanish um, recognition?
Um, I don't know if it was per se past life, but a lot of this trip in particular is really, really one of those once in many lifetimes kind of experiences. I knew that when I got invited to the trip that I had to make it happen at all costs. There were certain circumstances about the group that we were in where we were afforded really, really rare access to certain things along this whole trip. And like we got to not just hold, but partake in very particular Sufi dhikr and ceremonial rituals in very, very old places that hadn't hosted that kind of ceremony for like centuries types of things.
Amazing.
Yeah, it was really, and it was throughout the entire trip. And in the group, I was also the only Muslim, and I was an Arabic speaker, so I had extra special access everywhere we went. Where like kind of the sweetheart of the guards and stuff was just like, "Oh, I'm actually Muslim, and I speak your language. Show me what's up." And they would be delighted to like take me places. And actually, during this trip, the Templars were a really big thing that came up a lot. We were based in a lot of our time when we were in Israel was in Akka, which is Acre, old Templar town in the north.
Mhm.
So not really experiences, but it's just like definitely recognition that there's something there, and repeated themes that have come up throughout my study and such. But it was just really warm and a homecoming in the sense of like Jerusalem is one of those places, especially like being Muslim, raised in the West, that you just revere, and just the whole Arab concept too of just the Israel-Palestine conflict, which I won't get into, but just like to be in those lands, and there's such a charge, like the electricity in the air. There's like layers and layers and layers of you feel it, the prophets and the blood running through the streets, the heartache, the suffering, the conquerings, like all of that is so alive and still there. It's really potent. But one of the really nicest things was to have access at will to the Muslim quarter, um, where no one else in the group was able to do that. But yeah, you just have to like you go up to the guards and they test you if you like know certain verses from the Quran to prove that you're Muslim, and you could enter. And it's this like strange experience of this like especially like being so kind of outcast for your religious practices growing up and just being a minority, and to be in this place where everyone around you from all over the Muslim world is there and just friendly and visiting these sites and stuff. It was a more of a present life experience than past life, a lot
Yeah.
of it.
Very cool. Very cool. So, I mean, when it comes up, what do you think? What would you say the biggest Arabic influence on what we consider Western occultism is? And sort of follow-up question: do you think we're aware of its provenance? Right? Because I have my thoughts about what I think it is, but I would love to hear yours, of course.
Um, well, obviously, one of the first things that come up is works relating to astrological magic, like the astral influences as a whole, and the correlations of things, relating to the Picatrix, for example, and talismanic magic. But when you zoom out, it's a little more uh, basic than that. Like they're more essential components where um, the Muslims like the Muslim scholar, well, first of all, most of the Greek texts on basically the Muslim scholars and the Arab scholars and philosophers, they were the keepers of Greek text essentially, and they're the ones responsible for keeping a hold of that until almost the Western world was ready for it, pre-Renaissance, So a lot of the Greek and Hellenistic thoughts and texts were um, came through the hands of the Arabs and Muslims. So that in itself was a big factor. But even on a more essential basis relating to astrological magic is they had to legitimize magic
Yeah.
so that it wasn't seen as sorcery and sihr, which is one of the like 7 major sins according to like hadiths of the Prophet. So they legitimized magic as being more of a science and study of astrological effects of like the celestial bodies and how it works on nature in a way, in a context that was acceptable in a religious context. So um, for the Arabs to have gone through all these Hellenistic and Greek texts and treatises on these topics, and then filtering it through this lens of science and not just magic straight out, made it very adaptable and acceptable to be plugged into a Christian context. So that was that's in my opinion one of the like very one of the major factors. And
Yeah, that's exactly what I would have said too. Firstly, that all of those, if it's Agrippa or whoever, but whoever's talking about like reading the Greeks, I mean, they are, but they're very often reading them, particularly when it comes to astrology. They're also reading them with their um, Arabic commentators, or at least Muslim commentators. So there's a hidden intellectual influence, and the main one is this almost legalistic
absolutely.
technical argument to say, well, in fact, you can study this, and it's not down and dirty, which I like. It's not down and dirty witchcraft. It's more, yeah. It's almost like you're doing magic without the things that you're expressly forbidden not to have. And I had this. This is a take rather than an opinion I can defend. But if you look at how the grimoires show up in Europe, we obviously have coming in from the East. You have the actual grimoires, right, coming from like Byzantium, Constantinople, into Italy, and then up. Uh, and what you have coming from the west, like so over the mountains from Spain, is this way of doing magic where you're not allowed to summon spirits, right?
Hmm.
But it's almost like fishing. So you can either use a fishing rod and bait and so on, and that would be like a Solomonic evocation where you're going to like pull a fish out of the river or something. But the astrological or image magic stuff is kind of like setting up a net. So let's say you're not allowed to fish, but like, oh look, I'm just going to put my net here at this time, just on the bank in the
Totally.
water, and sort of sit back, and it's getting really, really good at. You still end up with the fish, right? But you have this sort of you get so good at timing and so good at observation that you actually don't have to, because you're not allowed to, like call the spirit up with like an evocation. And it just sort of feels to me that it became so good. It had to be so good at that timing and observation and use of material, because it wasn't allowed to do this other thing. And it feels like a funny, not funny haha, but like a legal argument to
Hmm.
to allow the practice of magic to continue.
Absolutely. Yeah, and just like magic as like an operational, like natural philosophy that was supported by these theories of like astrological and astral celestial influences. So there is this kind of, disowning some of those factors and just studying the different components in a very intellectual way and kind of piecing it together in a way that was acceptable.
And how does that differ from something like, or this is a or how does it feed into practices of Islamic, like specifically folk magic? Uh, is there a sort of image and astrological magic influence in it, or are the routes into Islamic folk magic different?
Well, when I say folk magic in general, I mean, I've heard you talk about this in some of in your works that I've read and heard, but it's just like the magic of the people and the time and the space. So whatever works for the people in their communities, like to me, that's what folk magic is. And for me, I reached a point in my I reached a point in my hermetic like initiatory work where it was starting to get really dry. Um, and I was becoming it was brought to my attention how top heavy and just like intellectual a lot of it was, and a little like stuffy. And how some of the material, a good amount of it needs to be updated for like this age that we're in and moving
Mm-hmm.
forward from like Victorian era, like white people. It's like, yeah, a lot of updating that is in the works. There's a lot of new things happening right now on those fronts, but um, in my own practice, it was starting to dry up, um, and all of a sudden, I was kind of like that Sufi saint that I had mentioned before, Hazrat al-Misr. He started showing up for me again, and I was guided to uh, look at some books of like Ibn Arabi, which I had on the shelf for years, but it and he's an Andalusian um, Sufi scholar, saint of the Akbarian tradition. But his work all of a sudden made sense to me. And I was like reading some of these books that completely before didn't make any sense. And I realized in going through these texts that I was almost sent to this Hermetic initiatory group for training to like bring me up to speed on the Neoplatonic traditions so that I could understand some of this like Sufi magic and texts. So this is also another like fractal roundabout way of
Yeah,
things
yeah.
coming about. And also, I started noticing I was starting to be brought to my attention about some of the Kemetic works and how that there are some Sufi traditions that, like Islamic book magic practices that are observed in Egypt, that have very pharaonic Kemetic influences. You can't separate the two, and that's what I really love about concepts like folk magic, but also Sufism in general. It's a very dynamic current that is always travels with the people of their time, and it has always preserved the cultural expressions, no matter where they ended up traveling to. So, and they were always on the fringes of society, and specifically in countries like um, Egypt, which when I was there last, it's just so apparent. Like um, the city of Cairo is built around a necropolis, like us, the city of the dead. And I spent a lot of time visiting a lot of the shrines and tombs and stuff. And they're they're straight up like old pharaonic, pre-Greco-Egyptian centers of pilgrimage that till this day people are still visiting and going to for miracles, for workings, for prayers, and of course they're all named after, like, somehow the prophet's like entire family is buried in Egypt. So they just kind of like said, oh yeah, this is the prophet's wife and this is the prophet's, like, the tomb of so and so and so and so, just to make it acceptable. But it's very, very old and it's still very alive. People, it's a big part of people's experiences of Islam. But usually that's also another factor where there's a separation that comes with class. So usually um, the falahin and the people who are not learned and educated are the ones who do these transgressive acts of worship where it's not pure Islam. A lot of their gatherings and festivals and ecstatic gatherings and stuff throughout time and history are usually outlawed by the um, Muslims in charge for being
Yeah.
backwards and heretical, and these people are not learned. They don't know any better type of thing. So that's always inherent also in that kind of separation, and that's also why folk magic is also considered. It gets wrapped up in that same vein of just heresy.
And it's also why the centering of it is usefully political. I actually grew up with a few Indonesian friends in
Mm.
Australia, but they were originally from there, and it's the same thing. The class aspect is there. So they're obviously middle class. One of them was a diplomat's daughter and a doctor and so on. But Islamic folk magic in an Indonesian context is the same thing. Like, so one of my friend's mothers, very middle class Indonesian woman, but still knew the the sort of fake holy man to go to for some weird mix of like Islam and like local Indonesian spirit customs. And I heard that sort of from her and from my friend because we went to school together, and that was this sort of realization that I remember once at university being really stoned, going like, everything is voodoo. Which, I mean, I got voodoo wrong, but what I meant by that was everything is a blend of like a location and the cosmology that you have when you encounter it. Because I was trying to explain, again, this is unfortunately insensitive and I wouldn't describe it this way now, but I was trying to say, like, so Indonesia has a voodoo. What I meant was now I would say it more like this, right? Which is you see the same thing when I have people like Jenks on the show. The same thing happens in places like Thailand, where what we call folk magic is that there's the official religion of the fancy people,
Mhm.
and there's the variant of it that interacts with like the needs and the biosphere of the yeah, the folk, I guess.
Oh, exactly. And one of the beautiful and powerful things too that can get wrapped up in the Islamic tradition is that by design, it was designed to spread widely. So, like as far as like the conquering efforts and rapid expansion of the faith, and the Islamic experience, I mean, it's tied together by the Arabic language and the core central factors of the Quran and the Quranic verses, and then the divine names of God and the Arabic letters. But aside from that, every culture, Islamic culture, has their own experience. Whether, I mean, Indonesia has the largest population of Muslims in the world. More than the a lot of these Middle Eastern countries, which says a lot. So, an Indonesian Muslim experience and how they break the fast in Ramadan and how they observe certain things has a flavor to it compared to in a Latin American country or in the Middle East. And then a lot of people don't really tend to look at in the West, like what does the Muslim youth in the West, experience? What is their version of folk that are just like version of Islam culturally, um,
Yeah.
And for me, I had spent years just like trying to find a teacher to teach me like talismanic Arabic magic or Muslim Sufi like there has to be someone I could find online. I'll fucking move to like Iran or somewhere, to learn this stuff. And at one point I just had to give up, like the fantasies of joining some like underground Picatrix or Ahmed al-Bunni like order wasn't going to happen. And just make do with what I had. And so I had this hermetic training and background as far as, correspondences and just the structure and how some of the technology, I guess, worked. But then I started intuiting a lot of just certain spells and practices and use of like the Arabic letters and verses from the Quran and names of God in my own practices. I mean, I was raised like very conservatively Muslim, but also like trained. Like I went to a version of a madrasa even up to like college, so like trained in like the memorization and diction and recitation of the Quran. And so a lot of the stuff came naturally, but just started plugging it in to my own workings, like doing certain workings, where you have the circles of protection on the floor and markings on the ground, and the Hebrew versions of it just weren't working that well for me. And then in one example, I plugged in some of the Arabic. I was guided into like some of the Arabic names of God and verses instead, and it was kind of like when you have your cell phone or computer screen and you put the brightness all the way up. It's not until then that you
Yeah.
could see like how dim it was before. Like all my sockets were plugged in, and you just follow the magic, follow what works. And yeah, it's been interesting. And then actually, this all came to a head pretty recently because I've been working on stuff on my own and just not really feeling like increasingly more so a lot of the hermetic stuff um, was just so dry in comparison to what was happening in my personal practice. And then I didn't know what to do with any of this, especially with my art. Also, just like a lot of things weren't working for me. And I just didn't know what to do with Muslim magic or anything. And then recently, just like December of 2019 until the beginning of last year, I had just a fated experience, another crazy travel experience where I was completely gifted a trip to Peru to help a friend out who was starting a retreat center um, for ayahuasca and a few other dietas and stuff. And I got invited to go down there and do some of the kickoff ceremonies with just like friends and family, and then stay as long as I needed to. And also I was helping out with some of the branding and merchandising, which is professionally some of my background. So down there I had a lot of personal work. A lot of things came up. It was really, really intense. I wasn't in the best of places. A lot of stagnancy in my life from a lot of different factors. But during that trip, I actually had an initiation, like during the ceremonies, had an initiation into my witchcraft, which completely was a complete game changer, where like the medicine showed me, and also the jungle is a great teacher. She's really hard ass. Does not play around, but just basically just shown how much more powerful and just how different things are magically when you're coming from being in right relation with your
Mm.
surroundings and with spirit as a whole, but also with the spirits, just like I had a few experiences. One in particular, which I'll share, is because especially, you're going to be off grid. So I came prepared with certain books and material that wasn't connected to technology. And one was, just a few different rituals from my curriculum that I was working through. And one was a water pentacle, like, or something, I don't know, Rosicrucian, Golden Dawny, and one person. I did a tobacco dieta in isolation, so I had a lot of time and room to myself, and it was really special. But this one particular time where I decided I was going to do this working, and I was like calling in all the water elementals under the and shouting out, and it was like in isolation. So I had the privacy to do these things and just like shouting out all the Hebrew names of God and power. And of course, the like thunder and lightning starts coming through and it starts raining, and I feel all proud and stuff. And I'm not saying that I caused it. It's more like, when you're working with these systems, you're just tuned into the rhythm of things already. So you kind of just intuitively know when to start some of these things. But I remember standing there, and then all the spirits of like the jungle, there were certain like animal, like oversoul group soul spirits, just all of them were just laughing at me, just like completely just like cracking up at me, and like, who do you think you are type of a thing, especially like with the spirits of the land, like shouting like Hebrew names, like doesn't really fly very well. There's like no space for that really. And it was, I don't know, like in my Solomonic state, I was just really a little offended. But then I also started laughing. It was just like, really, in the name of like Jehovah and Adonai and yada, 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 like ordering around the elementals to do my bidding and to praise the Lord. And just, it's like, what are you doing? So that was like one of the experiences. I had a number of experiences where I was just shown how much more effective and how important it is this time in history, especially moving forward, to just be in right relation with your surroundings, with your ancestors, with all of that. And magic works completely differently from that place. So I don't know. It took me a while to really own the identity of identifying as a witch publicly, but it is very different and counteropposed to the ideology of a magician. I feel, especially a Western magician, where it's just like so caught up in your will and imposing your will on everything. Where it's just like, that doesn't. I mean, yeah, it works, but you can only go so far, and it's you're just not in right relation.
No, it's funny because throughout the episode you've been talking about Hermeticism as like dry and almost like top heavy, and the jungle is the opposite, right? It couldn't be wetter,
Yeah.
and it's horizontal. Like it is, it is experienced very differently. Right relation is a horizontal connection. It is experienced horizontally rather than the sort of dry up and down.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, she has no
Yeah.
tolerance. The jungle has no tolerance for the dry concrete mentality and just like being shut off and kept to yourself. Like there's no space for you. And all the spirits of the jungle and animals and everything, it's just so alive. There's no space for you to be
Yeah.
in that functioning from that place.
Yeah, absolutely. Until you realize, until you've done it, you think you're getting away from it all. Like, I can leave New York or London or whatever and get some time to myself in the jungle. The jungle is the most crowded place you could ever be.
Absolutely.
It's the whole thing is like 24/7 subway. I got used to sleeping with earplugs in London because we were under the Heathrow flight path. But the jungle is so loud at
I
night
know.
that if I didn't have those earplugs, and even with them, like it was, the nights of ceremony when you kind of like crawl back to your tumbo, I didn't have them on then because I was still, with the medicine. But the nights that wasn't ceremony, I'm like, it's easy to sleep during the day because it's quieter. It's the most amazing place. And I have a sort of similar version of what happened to you trying to do something structured in the jungle, because I read a lot of animist stuff at the best of times. So when I went on Dieta, everyone else, at least the members and so on who came with, were reading animist books in the jungle. Makes sense. Makes
Yeah,
complete
it's
sense.
totally.
I went in the opposite direction, and I took like a book on like effectively Neoplatonism, but also like a very Neoplatonic tarot system, because I'm like, I'm going to see what happens in the opposite direction. And I could not. I've been reading tarot for 20 years. I couldn't understand the cards, and the book made no sense to me. Like I was just looking at them like they were unfamiliar, because they were. It was like my version of the spirits laughing at you as you're shouting Hebrew names in the Peruvian jungle.
Yeah.
Was it, nothing. Like they were barely even pictures, and I'm like, I can do this stuff and have done it, upside down on a whole bunch of LSD, whatever you want. But they just turned into wet paper.
Totally.
And it was that was one of those things that, yeah, the jungle, she shows you.
Yeah, whether you like it or not, you're on her turf.
Yeah, pretty
Yeah,
much.
yeah. And even in the ceremonies, like I was just completely like I had experiences where just showing the source of just that like power in the womb type of thing, like completely turning off the words and capability of putting things into language, even in thought form, and functioning from that really primal sacral place. It like the only word I could describe it was like an initiation into my witchcraft, which I mean, in the light of like comparing that in contrast to some of the hermetic and just all the ceremonial stuff and the structure and all of that, like it's like completely dead and alive, you know, just dry
Yeah,
concrete structure and just yeah, the complete opposite. So after that,
yeah,
I knew I had an insight and feeling of how to plug that into a lot of this Islamic folk magic that I had been just coming up with on my own, and just a lot of, and then my art came alive again, which had been really dry for a long time, and mainly because was really, I wasn't very comfortable in identifying publicly. I didn't know how much I needed to identify publicly as a Muslim and as a magician, as an artist and you know musician. I mean, plenty of people don't have to do that, so I was shying away from that. And then when I came back from Peru, I started having all these inspirations and ideas of kind of Muslim magical art pieces and talismanic, um, like attunement multimedia projects, like kind of big projects that kind of brought all of my experiences together. And yeah, everything's just been happening on its own ever since. It's yeah, just all kind of unfolding on its own pace.
oh, fantastic. Well, um, I I've kept you for too long already. I bet I could talk to you for a whole bunch more, especially as we just got to the jungle. But one of those projects, well, several of them are in fact coming up, aren't they? So, Bint, tell people what you got going on, and particularly if they're interested in the Islamic magic stuff,
Absolutely.
what they can do, where they can go.
Yeah, yeah. So a number of things coming up. One in particular, I'm working with a colleague, dear friend, fellow artist practitioner, Jay Hamadi, and myself. We're putting together we're working on a published anthology that is a collection of essays, art, and poetry of Muslims across the diaspora, speaking on their experiences of magic across the diaspora. And we're still in talks with the publishers about all the details, ironing that out. But if people stay in touch, I'll be announcing any call to submissions and such on that front. I do have a course coming up on a very brief but thorough intro to Muslim magic. I've been getting so many questions and people interested from both the Muslim uh, diaspora and a lot of young people, especially, which that's a big um, it's a soft spot for me, just knowing that there was not very much information on practical use of just how Islam has a tradition of this, even especially now, it's like being a witch and being into the occult is trendy right now. It's important for me to, or it's important to me to have some of this information accessible to people. So there's an intro course coming up sometime in February that people could attend. There'll be recordings available as well. And I'm currently working on a series of the multimedia talismanic series of performances and projects that are specifically around the planetary energies of Mars that I've been working on for quite some time, but that'll be released sometime in March. So there are a few things coming
Oh,
up.
why Mars?
I don't know. It just came up super, super strong. I couldn't get away from it, and of course it's all over my chart too. But yeah, that's what's been
Well,
coming
that's what
through.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's where my question was, because that's,
That's,
my ascendant ruler, so I'm
okay. Yeah.
interested.
Third decan Cancer is my Mars.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. So that came up super strong, and just yeah, just riding the waves, letting it come through, and it's exciting. I'm really excited about and really interested in how there's just so much that could be done around art and technology and magic. especially with things like social media and all these other factors. So I'm working with a few other artists on a few things in that vein. Some things.
Awesome. So obviously this will all be in the show notes, but where can people go to find you and the upcoming course and all that kind of stuff?
The best way would be through Instagram. That's where I update most of my things. You could find me at BINNTTT.
Nice one. Nice one. All right. Well, once again, thank you very much. This was a fascinating chat, and it's always fun to speak to someone who has jungle experiences
Yeah,
too.
likewise. Thanks for having me.